Imagine waking up every day in a world where your body is not entirely your own, where every choice, every action, every moment of your life is dictated not by your will, but by someone else's desire for profit. This was the grim reality faced by countless Africans who were enslaved in the Americas. People who were stripped of their freedom, their families, and their identities. But among the many horrors of slavery, there is a chapter that is rarely taught in schools. A chapter that exposes the chilling ways in which human lives were commodified for economic gain. The forced reproduction of enslaved people. In the antebellum South, enslaved Africans were often viewed not as human beings, but as property-valuable assets whose worth extended beyond their labor to their ability to produce the next generation of workers. Women, in particular, were seen as essential to this system, expected to bear children who would automatically become part of the enslaved population. Men and women alike were subjected to this dehumanizing perspective, their lives reduced to numbers, their bodies to instruments of profit. Families were torn apart, intimate relationships coerced, and children born into bondage before they could even take their first breath of freedom. This systematic approach to reproduction was supported by social, economic, and sometimes even religious rationalizations. Slaveholders argued that they were sustaining the labor force, claiming it was necessary for the survival of their plantations and, in their view, society at large. In reality, it was a calculated practice driven entirely by greed, with little regard for the pain and suffering inflicted upon the individuals involved. The stories that survive, recorded in testimonies and historical accounts, paint a vivid picture of resilience and endurance, as people found ways to survive and maintain their humanity even in the harshest conditions. Today, as we explore this deeply troubling chapter of history, it is important to remember the human cost behind these practices. Each statistic represents a life lived under oppression, each account a testament to the courage and strength of those who endured unimaginable circumstances. By understanding the past, we honor the lives of those who suffered and learn lessons about empathy, justice, and the importance of protecting human dignity in our world today. If you are ready to dive deeper into this story, to uncover the historical realities that are often left out of textbooks, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. By joining this community, you are helping to shine a light on history's untold stories and keep these important conversations alive. Don't forget to share this video with friends and family so more people can learn about the resilience and courage of those who came before us. Let us journey together into the past, to understand not only the horrors of slavery but also the strength of the human spirit that refused to be broken. This is a story that demands our attention, our reflection, and our commitment to ensuring that the lessons of history are never forgotten. As the system of slavery entrenched itself deeper into the fabric of society, many slaveholders sought ways to justify the cruel and dehumanizing practices that they enforced daily, turning not only to economics but also to religion to validate their actions. In an effort to rationalize a world in which human beings were treated as property, some white slave owners interpreted biblical texts in ways that suited their own interests, claiming divine sanction for practices that stripped Africans of their freedom, dignity, and even the most intimate aspects of their lives. One passage, in particular, from the book of Genesis, became a cornerstone of this twisted justification. The story of Noah and his sons, especially the curse upon Canaan, was distorted to suggest that the descendants of Africans were inherently destined for servitude. Through this interpretation, enslaved people were not only considered legally subordinate but morally and spiritually fated to serve, and their coerced reproduction was framed as part of the natural order, a divine mandate that purportedly endorsed the continuation of slavery through generations. This manipulation of Scripture was far from a peripheral excuse. It shaped the everyday realities of enslaved individuals. Influencing laws, social customs, and even the psychological landscape of both the oppressed and their oppressors. By invoking the Bible, slaveholders cloaked their economic ambitions in moral and spiritual language, creating a narrative that could be recited in courts, churches, and households alike, all to defend the status quo and suppress dissent. In this way, religious justification became a tool not only to enforce obedience but also to normalize a system in which men, women, and children were assessed for their labor potential and reproductive capacity, treated as commodities whose value extended far beyond physical strength or skill. The lives of enslaved people were measured in ways that mirrored livestock management, a chilling reflection of how deeply dehumanization was institutionalized. Enslaved women, in particular, bore the double burden of production and reproduction. Their daily existence was governed by demands to work the fields, tend to households, and simultaneously bear children whose futures were predetermined by the same oppressive system. Men were compelled to labor with unrelenting physical intensity, while also being monitored for traits that could increase the future productivity of their offspring. Every birth was anticipated not with joy or celebration, but with the cold calculation of financial return, and this expectation was framed as being in alignment with divine will. In letters, diaries, and testimonies from the period, it becomes evident that slaveholders saw themselves as executing a moral duty, or at least convincing themselves that their actions were sanctioned by heaven, even as they violated the most basic principles of human dignity. The psychological impact of this religiously sanctioned oppression cannot be overstated. For enslaved people, the knowledge that their bodies and the bodies of their children were regarded as instruments of profit, justified through Scripture, added an additional layer of suffering to an already intolerable reality. It was not simply that freedom was denied, but that the very notion of personhood was undermined by the ideological scaffolding built around these biblical interpretations. Women were often subjected to coercion in intimate matters. Men were surveilled for potential traits to be passed down, and entire families were monitored for their reproductive value. The intersection of faith, power, and profit created a system in which enslaved people were forced to internalize their own subjugation in order to survive, navigating a world where divine language was wielded as an instrument of control. Historical accounts reveal how this distorted religious reasoning seeped into every facet of the institution. From the grand halls of colonial courts to the modest chapels scattered across plantations, the biblical rationale was recited and reinforced, lending an air of inevitability to practices that were, in truth, the result of human greed and cruelty. It was a sophisticated form of moral deception. By cloaking economic exploitation in spiritual legitimacy, slaveholders were able to maintain social order and quell ethical opposition, persuading even some members of the broader community that the oppression they witnessed was natural, ordained, and unchangeable. This ideological framework not only justified the forced reproduction of enslaved people, but also reinforced the perception of racial hierarchy as something that existed outside human law, a cosmic order that could not be questioned without challenging the very foundations of faith itself. Yet even within this grim context, the resilience of the human spirit persisted. Enslaved individuals often recognized the manipulative use of Scripture and found ways to resist, preserve their identities, and pass on alternative interpretations that nurtured hope. Cultural continuity, and a sense of justice. Stories of clandestine teaching, spiritual resistance, and subtle defiance illustrate that the spiritual arguments used to oppress were never fully uncontested. People adapted, survived, and maintained their humanity despite the pervasive attempt to redefine it. Through personal rituals, oral histories, and shared narratives. Enslaved Africans created spaces in which faith became a source of empowerment rather than subjugation, turning a tool of oppression into a vehicle for resilience. In understanding this historical reality, we see that the intertwining of religion and economics was not a benign feature of the past, but a deliberate strategy to maintain power and control. The manipulation of scripture to justify slavery and forced reproduction illuminates how human belief can be shaped to serve material interests. And conversely, how awareness, critique, and reinterpretation of those beliefs can become acts of survival and resistance. The story of enslaved Africans, their coerced reproduction, and the distorted biblical justifications surrounding it reminds us of the profound consequences when power, profit, and ideology collide. It is a narrative that challenges us to reflect on the ways in which morality can be invoked for exploitation and the enduring capacity of individuals to resist dehumanization, preserve their dignity, and assert their humanity against overwhelming odds. As the institution of slavery took root and flourished across the American South, the lives of enslaved individuals were measured not by their humanity, but by the value they could generate for their owners. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the way children were perceived. From the moment a child was born to an enslaved woman, their life was intertwined with a system that regarded them as both a future laborer and a financial asset, a living embodiment of economic potential rather than the promise of a life lived freely. Every birth was carefully observed, every child catalogued, and every moment of development monitored for signs that they would contribute to the growth of the plantation's productivity. In many, the arrival of a new child was less a celebration of life than an accounting of profit, a calculated addition to the workforce that would ensure the continuity of both labor and wealth. Enslaved women bore this reality with a heavy burden, their bodies subjected to constant scrutiny as owners and overseers gauged their fertility and their potential to produce children who could be raised to serve the demands of plantation life. The expectation was relentless. Each child added to the plantation's labor pool, and with each addition, the economic value of the mother increased. Women were rewarded with small incentives or promises, yet these were always overshadowed by the coercive nature of the system, in which refusal or failure to produce could result in punishment, social isolation, or even the sale of family members. Mothers carried the weight of these expectations while simultaneously witnessing their children treated as property, trained for labor, and sometimes separated from their families to maximize profits and maintain control over the workforce. The commodification of children extended beyond simple labor. Slave owners calculated their potential value in markets, anticipating that boys would grow into strong field hands and girls into productive mothers, continuing the cycle of coerced reproduction and economic gain. Plantation ledgers sometimes recorded births in ways that mirrored livestock inventories, noting health, growth, and quality in terms of potential labor output. The market value of children fluctuated based on these assessments, and enslaved families lived under the constant anxiety that their very lives could be appraised, bought, or sold depending on the whims of owners who saw them as investments rather than people. The concept of human life was warped into a system where survival, growth, and development were inseparable from financial calculus, and where the bonds of love and family were routinely overridden by profit motives. Historical accounts and first-hand testimonies reveal the chilling precision with which this system was maintained. Formerly enslaved individuals recounted being separated from siblings, being sold off to distant plantations, and witnessing their parents forced into reproductive arrangements to maximize the number of children they could bear. One narrative tells of a young girl being praised for her fertility, marketed as future breeding stock, with promises made not to her, but to prospective buyers who viewed her capacity to bear children as a critical asset. Enslaved men were similarly monitored for traits considered valuable, such as physical strength and resilience, with the hope that these qualities would be passed down to the next generation. In this way, the institution of slavery treated both men and women as components of an intricate economic machinery, their bodies and offspring systematically harnessed to sustain the cycle of labor and profit. Yet, amid this dehumanization, the human spirit persisted. Children born under such circumstances were nurtured in secret moments of care, taught resilience, and imbued with stories, traditions, and faith that provided strength beyond the reach of their oppressors. Mothers and fathers found ways to preserve the bonds of family and culture, even when the system sought to erase them. Sharing lessons, songs, and histories that would survive despite the efforts to reduce their lives to economic units. These acts of quiet resistance demonstrate that, while the enslavers could manipulate circumstances and bodies, they could not extinguish the core of human identity, creativity, and hope. The economic logic that treated children as assets also intersected with broader societal and political structures. Laws and customs were designed to protect the financial interests of slaveholders, ensuring that the human commodities under their control remained profitable. Children were not merely part of a family, they were collateral, a guarantee of future labor and a hedge against mortality rates, disease, and the unpredictability of agricultural life. In this sense, enslaved people became the foundation of wealth in a society built on forced labor, with children representing both continuity and the perpetuation of an oppressive economic model that spanned generations. Understanding the lives of these children illuminates the stark contrast between the human potential they embodied and the constricted roles forced upon them. Their experiences reveal the systemic cruelty of an institution that valued life not for its inherent dignity, but for its utility to others. It is a history marked by both suffering and extraordinary resilience, where the bonds of love, the persistence of memory, and the strength of familial connection survived against the machinery of exploitation. By reflecting on these stories, we confront the profound consequences of viewing human beings as assets, and we are reminded of the enduring importance of recognizing and defending the inherent value of every life. Through these narratives, we come to see the full scope of how slavery shaped not only the lives of those directly enslaved, but the moral and economic framework of an entire society, leaving legacies that continue to inform discussions of justice, equity, and human dignity today. The children born into bondage were far more than property. They were the bearers of resilience, the quiet custodians of culture and memory, and the living testament to the strength of the human spirit even under the harshest conditions. Amid the pervasive oppression and systematic exploitation of enslaved people, stories of resistance and legal challenge began to emerge across the Atlantic, demonstrating that even within the seemingly insurmountable structures of slavery, human courage and the pursuit of justice could find a voice. In Britain, the mid-18th century witnessed landmark legal cases that would send ripples through the institution of slavery and challenge the very notion that human beings could be owned as property. Among these, the case of James Somerset in 1772 and the later suit of Joseph Knight in 1778 stand as pillars in the fight against the legal acceptance of enslavement, showing how the law could be both an instrument of oppression and a tool for liberation. James Somerset, an enslaved African man brought to England by his master, Charles Stuart, had been purchased and transported with the expectation of obedience and the continuation of his subjugation. When Somerset attempted to assert his own will by seeking freedom, he was captured and detained, facing imminent transport back to the colonies where he would have remained in bondage. What followed was a legal battle that would captivate the nation and expose the contradictions within a society that claimed liberty as a fundamental value while simultaneously tolerating slavery. Somerset's case reached the Court of King's Bench, where Chief Justice Lord Mansfield was tasked with deciding whether the abduction and intended re-enslavement of Somerset was lawful under English common law. The arguments presented were not merely technical. They questioned the moral and legal foundations of slavery in a country where the institution was not codified by positive law, unlike in the colonies. Mansfield's ruling, which ultimately discharged Somerset, became a defining moment, setting a precedent that the courts in England could not legally endorse slavery, and affirming the principle that freedom within English soil could not be arbitrarily denied. Yet the fight did not end with Somerset. The case of Joseph Knight, a man purchased in Jamaica and brought to Scotland, brought the issue into sharp relief once again. Knight challenged the claim of perpetual servitude asserted by his master, arguing that Scottish law did not recognize chattel slavery and that he was entitled to live as a free man. In the Court of Session of Scotland, the ruling affirmed Knight's freedom, reinforcing the idea that slavery, as practiced in the colonies, held no legitimate authority on British soil. These cases were not simply isolated victories. They were symbolic confrontations with an entrenched system, demonstrating that legal reasoning could be marshaled in defense of human dignity, and that the law could serve as a shield against the most extreme forms of oppression. The significance of these rulings extended beyond the individual plaintiffs, influencing public opinion and galvanizing the abolitionist movement. Anti-slavery advocates in Britain, inspired by these legal precedents, intensified their campaigns, linking the moral, economic, and religious arguments against slavery to concrete legal victories that could be cited to expose the inherent injustice of human bondage. Prominent figures such as William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, and members of the Quaker community leveraged these cases to push for legislative reform, demonstrating that the erosion of slavery's legitimacy in the courts could catalyze wider societal change. The narratives of Somerset and Knight were disseminated widely, entering public discourse as stories of courage and the pursuit of justice, reminding citizens that the law could uphold principles of fairness even against powerful economic interests. The cases also illuminated the complex intersection of law, economics, and morality. While British courts recognized the illegitimacy of slavery domestically, the colonies and overseas territories continued to operate under slave-based economies, and slaveholders argued strenuously to protect their investments and labor forces. The contrast between domestic rulings and colonial practices highlighted the moral dissonance inherent in a society that professed liberty yet profited from enslavement abroad. Somerset and Knight's victories provided a legal and ethical touchstone for abolitionists, framing slavery not merely as an economic convenience but as a violation of human rights that could be contested through reasoned argument and legal action. Beyond the courtroom, these landmark cases had profound psychological and cultural impacts. Enslaved people across Britain and its territories became aware that freedom was not entirely out of reach, that the machinery of law could be invoked in defense of humanity, and that the assertion of individual rights could yield tangible results. The cases served as a beacon of hope, inspiring both subtle and overt acts of resistance, from daily defiance of imposed labor to strategic escapes and appeals to sympathetic allies. In essence, Somerset and Knight became more than legal precedents. They became symbols of the possibility of change, demonstrating that human agency could challenge entrenched systems even in the face of overwhelming odds. The broader implications of these legal battles reverberated into legislative reforms, eventually contributing to the outlawing of the Atlantic slave trade in Britain in 1807 and the abolition of slavery throughout the empire in the subsequent decades. They showed that law, often seen as a reflection of power, could also function as an instrument of justice when applied courageously and thoughtfully. The stories of Somerset and Knight remind us that even within oppressive systems, individuals can challenge injustice, that the assertion of rights can catalyze systemic change, and that legal victories can inspire moral and cultural transformation. These cases are not merely historical footnotes. They are enduring lessons in resilience, courage, and the enduring struggle to align society's laws with principles of human dignity and freedom, linking directly to the broader narratives of resistance, survival, and the fight for recognition and justice that define the history of enslaved peoples. The momentum built by courageous individuals, compelling legal cases, and relentless advocacy eventually culminated in legislative victories that reshaped the moral and economic landscape of the British Empire, demonstrating that persistent struggle and public pressure could translate into profound social transformation. By the early 19th century, the voices of abolitionists, evangelicals, Quakers, and enlightened secular thinkers alike had grown too powerful to ignore, blending moral reasoning with political strategy to challenge the entrenched system of human trafficking that had enriched nations and enslaved millions for centuries. Parliament, facing mounting pressure from activists who tirelessly highlighted both the inhumanity and immorality of the slave trade, passed the landmark Slave Trade Act of 1807, effectively prohibiting the transatlantic shipment of enslaved Africans by British merchants. This moment was not merely a legislative milestone, but a symbolic assertion that human life could no longer be treated as a commodity for profit, and that the ethical imperatives of justice and freedom could, at long last, be recognized at the highest levels of governance. The 1807 Act, while groundbreaking, was only the first step in a broader, more arduous journey toward the eradication of slavery itself, as the institution was deeply embedded not only in the economy, but also in the social and cultural fabric of colonial life. Wealthy planters, merchants, and financiers who had long profited from enslaved labor resisted change fiercely, exploiting loopholes, smuggling enslaved individuals, and appealing to economic arguments in defense of their interests. The enforcement of abolition was uneven, and the transatlantic networks that had enabled the triangular trade for decades did not simply vanish overnight. Nonetheless, the Act laid the legal groundwork for a moral and political reckoning, signaling to both the public and the colonies that the system of enslaving human beings for labor was increasingly indefensible in the eyes of law and conscience. Over the following decades, abolitionists intensified their campaigns, using the 1807 Act as a foundation to demand the full emancipation of enslaved people throughout the British Empire. Through a combination of lobbying, petitions, public speaking, and publication of first-hand accounts, activists worked tirelessly to expose the brutality of slavery and its psychological, physical, and social tolls, the stories of enslaved individuals, their coerced labor, forced reproduction, and treatment as property were brought to the attention of the public in unprecedented ways, humanizing the victims and making the moral argument for abolition impossible to ignore. By highlighting both the suffering and the resilience of enslaved people, these accounts created empathy, galvanized public opinion, and applied relentless pressure on legislators to act. This sustained advocacy bore fruit in 1833, when the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, legally ending slavery in most British colonies and initiating a transitional system of indentured apprenticeship designed to prepare formerly enslaved individuals for full freedom while ostensibly protecting the economic interests of former slaveholders. Although the apprenticeship system delayed complete autonomy, it represented a decisive shift. The principle that no human being could lawfully be owned or exploited indefinitely was now codified, and the path toward emancipation was firmly established. By 1843, with the completion of transitional arrangements, the vast majority of formerly enslaved people within the empire were legally free, a testament to decades of moral, legal, and political struggle that had transformed both laws and societal attitudes. The abolition of slavery in the British Empire was deeply intertwined with economic considerations, as well as moral imperatives. Activists and reformers had to confront not only entrenched interests but also the financial structures that sustained slavery, including banks, shipping companies, and colonial industries dependent on enslaved labor. The process of ending slavery required not only legal decrees but also the reimagining of economic systems, the redistribution of labor, and the gradual dismantling of institutions that had normalized the commodification of human life. Every piece of legislation, every public campaign, and every courtroom victory contributed to a broader cultural and economic shift, demonstrating that moral courage and strategic advocacy could reshape even the most entrenched systems of exploitation. Beyond the immediate legal and economic ramifications, the abolition of slavery in Britain and its colonies carried profound social and psychological significance. For formerly enslaved people, emancipation represented the reclamation of agency, the restoration of personal dignity, and the opportunity to rebuild families and communities that had been fragmented by decades of forced labor and systematic oppression. For the broader society, the end of slavery challenged prevailing notions of racial hierarchy and human value, forcing citizens, lawmakers, and institutions to confront the ethical contradictions that had underpinned colonial economies and domestic practices. The lessons of abolition emphasized that human freedom, justice, and dignity could not be indefinitely subordinated to profit, and that collective action could produce transformative change, even against formidable resistance. Moreover, the legislative victories of 1807 and 1833 set a precedent that resonated far beyond Britain, influencing international discourse on slavery and human rights. They provided a model for moral and legal argumentation, demonstrating how persistent advocacy, evidence, and ethical reasoning could lead to systemic change. Activists in other nations drew inspiration from Britain's journey, applying similar strategies to challenge slavery in their own societies, while enslaved and formerly enslaved individuals used the legal and moral frameworks established by these victories to assert claims of freedom, rights, and justice. The story of Britain's abolition of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery itself illustrates the complex interplay between law, morality, economics, and social consciousness. It reminds us that systemic injustice can be challenged through sustained effort, that legal victories can serve as catalysts for broader societal transformation, and that moral clarity, when combined with persistent action, has the power to reshape institutions and restore humanity to those long denied it. The passage of the 1807 Act and the eventual abolition of slavery in colonies by the 1840s are not only historical milestones but enduring lessons in the pursuit of justice, showing how determined advocacy and ethical courage can dismantle even the most entrenched systems of exploitation, leaving a legacy that continues to inform conversations about human rights, freedom, and dignity today. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is not only a tale of human suffering and resilience, but also one of staggering economic transformation, where European powers, particularly Britain, reaped enormous profits from a network that spanned continents, connecting Africa, the Americas, and Europe in a triangular web of commerce, exploitation, and human commodification. The system was built upon meticulous organization and ruthless efficiency, as enslaved Africans were captured, transported under brutal conditions, and sold in colonies where their labor fueled the production of lucrative commodities such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton. British merchants and financiers orchestrated these operations with precision, trading manufactured goods in European ports for enslaved people in West Africa, shipping them across the Atlantic under perilous conditions, and then selling them to plantation owners in the Americas, where the fruits of their forced labor were then sent back to European markets. The scale of this commerce was immense, with estimates suggesting that millions of Africans were forcibly transported over the course of the trade, generating profits that underpinned the wealth of cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and London, and enriched individuals ranging from merchants to members of the royal family. The triangular trade functioned as a continuous cycle of economic exploitation, where each leg of the journey reinforced the profitability of the system. In Europe, manufactured goods, textiles, firearms, and other items were shipped to the African coast, where local leaders, often complicit through complex political and economic arrangements, exchanged captives for goods that transformed local economies and power dynamics. The human cargo was then transported across the Atlantic in the infamous Middle Passage, a voyage marked by horrific conditions, disease, and death, which was nonetheless treated by merchants as a calculable risk in a profitable enterprise. Survivors were sold into lifelong bondage, contributing to plantation economies that produced commodities essential for European consumption and global trade. The profits from this trade were immense, not only in direct financial gain but in the broader accumulation of capital that fueled industrial expansion, urban development, and political influence in Britain and other European powers. This economic system intertwined with social and political structures in ways that reinforced both power and complicity. Wealth generated from the slave trade was invested in infrastructure, shipping, and banking institutions that would later become cornerstones of European economic dominance. British ports prospered, creating a merchant class whose influence extended into Parliament and colonial administration, ensuring that the trade continued despite growing moral opposition. Even members of the monarchy held stakes in trading companies, benefiting indirectly from the profits of human trafficking. This intertwining of personal, institutional, and national economic interests made the abolition of the trade a monumental challenge, requiring decades of moral advocacy, legal maneuvering, and political negotiation to overcome the entrenched financial incentives that sustained it. The human dimension of this commerce was equally profound, as the commodification of life became normalized within both the colonies and the metropole. Enslaved people were reduced to units of labor, their worth measured in pounds sterling, their families fragmented to optimize economic output, and their identities suppressed to ensure compliance and efficiency. The economic incentives drove practices such as systematic breeding of enslaved Africans, where reproductive capacity was assessed as a means to increase the labor force and generate future profit. Women, in particular, were valued not only for their labor but for their capacity to produce the next generation of workers, creating a system in which human reproduction was directly tied to economic calculation. These practices, while appallingly inhumane, were rationalized through prevailing economic theories, legal structures, and, at times, distorted moral or religious reasoning, allowing the trade to flourish for centuries despite the suffering it inflicted. As the trade expanded, its tentacles reached deep into every facet of life, shaping the economies, societies, and political structures of Europe and the Americas. Cities became wealthy on the back of slavery-generated capital, investing in docks, warehouses, and financial institutions, while plantation economies in the Americas relied on a steady supply of enslaved labor to maintain production. The global scale of this system meant that the profits of slavery were not confined to the colonies, but circulated through international markets, reinforcing the interdependence of continents and the centrality of human exploitation to economic development. British involvement was particularly pronounced, as the nation sought to monopolize portions of the trade, negotiating contracts such as the Asian Tour with Spain to supply enslaved Africans to colonial markets, and establishing companies specifically designed to facilitate and profit from the trafficking of human lives. Despite the legal abolition of the slave trade in 1807, the economic impact and legacy of this system endured, as wealth accumulated through centuries of exploitation continued to shape British society, finance, and industry. Even after formal emancipation, the social and economic structures built upon slavery did not vanish overnight. Former colonial investments, established trade networks, and the profits accrued from centuries of human suffering continued to influence policy, commerce, and societal hierarchies. Understanding this economic dimension is essential to grasping the full scale of the transatlantic slave trade, as it reveals not only the suffering endured by millions but also the systemic and calculated nature of the exploitation, where human lives were inseparably linked to the growth and prosperity of nations. By examining this vast network of trade, one begins to see the deliberate intersections of commerce, law, politics, and social order that allowed slavery to endure for centuries. The British Empire, while ultimately pioneering steps toward abolition, was also a principal beneficiary of this exploitative system. Its wealth, industrialization, and global influence shaped in no small measure by the labor and suffering of enslaved Africans. The triangular trade thus stands as a stark reminder of the capacity for economic systems to perpetuate injustice, the moral responsibility of societies to reckon with their past, and the enduring consequences that profit-driven exploitation can have on human lives and historical trajectories. It is a story of tragedy and resilience, oppression and advocacy, and the indelible mark that the transatlantic slave trade left on the interconnected worlds of Africa, Europe, and the Americas, echoing through centuries of social, economic, and cultural development. As the transatlantic slave trade expanded and the institution of slavery became deeply entrenched in the Americas, certain cities emerged as pivotal hubs where human lives were commodified, bought, and sold with the same casual calculation as livestock or grain. And among the most notorious of these were New Orleans and Louisville, cities whose growth, wealth, and urban development were inextricably linked to the trade and exploitation of enslaved people. In New Orleans, the port's strategic location along the Mississippi River allowed it to become the beating heart of a vast commercial network that funneled enslaved Africans from coastal ports and Caribbean holdings into the interior of the southern United States, creating a marketplace where human beings were scrutinized for their physical strength, skills, and reproductive potential, all factors that could determine the price a buyer was willing to pay. Auction houses lined the streets, where men, women, and children were inspected, appraised, and sold, their futures determined not by their own choices or talents, but by the economic calculations of those who had purchased them. The city's prosperity, in turn, was fueled by the wealth generated through this trade, as plantations supplied with this human labor produced cash crops, sugar, cotton, and tobacco that fed both domestic and international markets, reinforcing the systemic intertwining of human exploitation and economic development. Louisville, positioned on the Ohio River, served a similar function, functioning as a central node for the movement of enslaved people from border states to deeper southern markets. Here, enslaved families were often separated, their lives dissected into labor categories and profit expectations. As traders sought to maximize returns, male laborers were prized for field work, while women were valued for their ability to reproduce and contribute to the plantation workforce over decades, a cruel calculus that stripped them of autonomy and subjected generations to bondage. The city's markets were structured with rigorous attention to the valuation of human life in financial terms, with advertisements in local newspapers describing age, health, and physical attributes, often reducing a human being to a ledger entry or a commodity label. reflecting a systemic normalization of treating people as property. The wealth that flowed through Louisville did not only enrich individual traders and plantation owners, but also funded broader civic development, including infrastructure, shipping, and local industry, ensuring that the economic benefits of slavery permeated many layers of urban life, while its human costs were obscured, minimized, or justified through a combination of economic logic and entrenched social ideologies. Within these hubs, the commodification of human beings extended beyond mere sales into every aspect of urban economic and social structure. Enslaved individuals were leveraged as collateral. Their labor and potential offspring factored into financial agreements, loans, and estate planning, illustrating how deeply the perception of people as property was embedded within the economy. The auction blocks were not isolated incidents, but were part of a sophisticated, systematized network of commerce that connected ports, river transport, warehouses, and plantations, with each actor from the ship captain to the banker playing a role in perpetuating the profitability of human bondage. This infrastructure ensured that the trading cities were not only marketplaces, but also centers of logistical innovation, designed to maximize efficiency in a morally indefensible system, where profit outweighed humanity and economic gain justified the systematic abuse of millions. The impact on those enslaved was profound, shaping family structures, cultural continuity, and personal identity. Families were routinely broken apart, as men, women, and children were sold to different owners based on market demands. Physical attributes, or reproductive potential, severing bonds that had sustained generations. This systemic disruption was compounded by the legal frameworks of the time, which enshrined ownership, restricted movement, and denied the most basic rights, embedding oppression within both public and private spheres of life. Children born into these cities, marketplaces were immediately assigned a value and a labor trajectory, perpetuating cycles of exploitation as their futures were predetermined by the economic interests of others. In New Orleans and Louisville, the concentration of enslaved populations facilitated both the efficiency of trade and the normalization of dehumanization, creating a social ecosystem in which cruelty became routine and profit became the primary metric of human worth. Yet, amidst this darkness, there were acts of resilience, subtle resistance, and enduring cultural preservation. Enslaved people navigated these oppressive environments with ingenuity, maintaining cultural practices, forging networks of mutual support, and in some cases, escaping to freedom via the river networks that also facilitated the slave trade. The same rivers that carried human cargo to auction blocks were also routes of hope for those daring enough to flee, illustrating a duality in these urban centers as spaces of both profound oppression and quiet resilience. Despite the overwhelming forces arrayed against them, the enslaved created moments of community, spirituality, and resistance, asserting their humanity even in cities designed to suppress it. Understanding New Orleans and Louisville as hubs of the slave trade reveals the systemic nature of slavery, where urban growth, economic development, and social hierarchies were built upon the deliberate commodification of human lives. These cities exemplify how the economic imperatives of slavery shaped urban landscapes, social policies, and cultural memory, and they serve as enduring reminders of the intertwining of wealth and human exploitation in history. Through these narratives, the human cost of commerce becomes visible, emphasizing that the foundations of economic prosperity in these regions were inseparable from the suffering endured by millions of enslaved Africans and their descendants, whose labor and lives were treated as instruments of profit. By tracing the intricate connections between trade, urban development, and human exploitation, The story of New Orleans and Louisville stands as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the resilience of those who endured the horrors of a system designed to treat them as property, leaving an indelible mark on the historical and moral landscape of the United States. As the institution of slavery entrenched itself across the southern United States, the lives of enslaved children became a central focus for plantation owners and traders, who viewed every individual born into bondage not as a person with inherent dignity, but as an economic unit whose potential labor and future productivity could be meticulously measured, nurtured, and exploited for maximum gain, creating a system in which childhood itself was subsumed under the cold calculus of profit. Productivity. From the moment of birth, enslaved children were observed for signs of health, strength, and vitality, their growth and development tracked with the same scrutiny that a breeder might apply to livestock, as owners sought to ensure that each new generation could meet the labor demands of the sprawling plantations and contribute to the economic engine that sustained the slaveholding elite. The daily lives of these children were shaped by routines and practices designed to instill endurance, physical resilience, and familiarity with the work that would one day define their existence. With overseers, trainers, and even family members under duress expected to participate in conditioning the young for a life of toil. In this system, play and education were subordinated to physical training and early labor exposure, as even the youngest were introduced to the rhythms of plantation work in ways that would prepare them for future responsibilities. Boys were guided through tasks that cultivated strength, dexterity, and endurance, learning to handle tools, tend fields, and perform the rigorous labor that would make them valuable as field hands, artisans, or drivers of production. Girls, meanwhile, were trained not only in the skills required for agricultural labor, but also in domestic duties and, tragically, the reproductive expectations imposed by a society that treated their capacity to bear children as a direct contribution to the plantation's workforce and profitability. The cultivation of these skills was rarely gentle or compassionate. Rather, it was regimented, driven by the interests of those who saw human potential only through the lens of economic return. With failure, illness, or perceived weakness punished or noted as deficiencies that could affect a child's perceived value. The monitoring of enslaved children extended beyond simple observation to include structured interventions designed to optimize physical and emotional endurance. Plantation owners and overseers maintained detailed records of growth, productivity, and health, sometimes using rudimentary medical treatments to ensure survival and peak performance, and even employing exercises or competitions to test strength, stamina, and agility, thereby determining which children were best suited for specific forms of labor. In some accounts, children were subjected to exercises or races to assess their potential contribution to fieldwork, with those deemed most capable being groomed for the hardest labor, while others were allocated to lighter tasks that still reinforced their utility to the plantation economy. This system of assessment and training underscored a merciless logic in which every aspect of a child's early life was a transaction in the service of profitability, a framework that imposed intense psychological and physical burdens on individuals who had no agency over their circumstances. The commodification of childhood extended to the emotional and social spheres, as family bonds were often disrupted to meet labor needs or maximize financial return. Siblings could be separated, and parents were powerless to shield their children from the demands of owners who prioritized productivity over human connection. In many cases, enslaved mothers were compelled to care for children, not only for their own survival but also for the material benefit of the plantation, fostering a complicated dynamic in which love, protection, and survival coexisted with systemic exploitation. The psychological impact of these practices was profound, as children internalized the precariousness of their positions, the constant surveillance, and the understanding that their value was measured by their ability to endure, perform, and reproduce within the confines of an oppressive system. This early conditioning also had long-term economic implications. Children who thrived under this regimen grew into adults capable of sustaining and even expanding the plantation workforce, becoming both producers of labor and, in some cases, reproducers of the next generation of enslaved people, perpetuating a cycle of exploitation that reinforced the wealth and power of slaveholding families. The careful management of growth, health, and training ensured that plantations could rely on a continuous, self-replenishing labor force without the same level of dependence on imported enslaved people, creating a system that was both economically strategic and morally indefensible. The systematic approach to raising enslaved children demonstrates the depth of planning and investment that owners applied to human property, revealing a calculated approach to sustaining and increasing wealth at the cost of individual freedom and dignity. Even amidst these oppressive conditions, enslaved children exhibited resilience, resourcefulness, and the beginnings of cultural continuity, learning to navigate the constraints imposed upon them, finding ways to play, learn, and maintain bonds of kinship and community despite the relentless pressures to conform to the roles assigned by their owners. Their experiences highlight both the human capacity for endurance and adaptation and the inhumanity of a system that sought to mold individuals into tools of economic production from birth, stories passed down through generations. Oral histories and archival records attest to the strength, intelligence, and courage of these children, whose early lives were defined by labor yet whose spirits often found ways to assert agency, identity, and survival within an environment designed to suppress both. Understanding how enslaved children were monitored and trained to maximize labor productivity provides crucial insight into the mechanics of the plantation system and the social, economic, and psychological structures that supported slavery. It illuminates the extent to which human exploitation was systematized, extending beyond adults to include the youngest members of the enslaved community, and demonstrates the careful orchestration required to sustain such a brutal institution over centuries. This narrative is a testament to the cruelty embedded in economic systems built on human commodification, the endurance of those subjected to these conditions, and the complex interplay of oppression, resilience, and survival that defines the historical memory of slavery in the Americas, underscoring the profound human cost behind the prosperity and growth of the regions that benefited from such practices. The practice of slave breeding, a calculated and deliberate aspect of the institution of slavery, inflicted profound and enduring damage on the personal lives, families, and cultural identities of enslaved Africans, creating scars that would reverberate across generations, shaping not only the immediate experience of those forced into bondage, but also the collective memory and resilience of their descendants. Within the plantations, enslaved families were subjected to systematic disruption, with husbands, wives, and children often sold to different owners or relocated across vast distances to satisfy labor demands. A cruel mechanism designed to maximize economic return while undermining the natural social bonds that might foster resistance or solidarity. Mothers were forced to bear children under the constant surveillance of overseers, their reproductive capacity commodified, and their children treated as future laborers or economic assets, a reality that stripped away the intimacy and agency of family life, reducing relationships to transactions in the eyes of those who profited from their bondage. Fathers, frequently separated from their partners and offspring, struggled to maintain connections under the impossible conditions imposed upon them, their roles diminished or rendered symbolic, and any attempts to resist the separation or assert authority over their children met with harsh reprisals. The erosion of family bonds extended beyond mere physical separation. It penetrated the emotional and psychological fabric of enslaved communities, shaping self-perception, identity, and social cohesion. Children grew up witnessing the commodification of their parents and themselves, internalizing the notion that their worth was tied not to their humanity, but to the labor they could perform or the profit they could generate. This imposed valuation distorted familial roles as nurturing, protection, and parental guidance were subordinated to the imperatives of productivity and economic calculation, creating generational patterns in which trauma, insecurity, and the struggle for survival became inherited elements of everyday life. Siblings were often divided to meet labor requirements. Friends were severed, and the broader community experienced constant disruption, undermining networks of support that might have preserved cultural practices, oral traditions, and the social knowledge that connected generations. Cultural heritage, already under assault through the forced transplantation of Africans into alien environments, suffered further erosion due to the deliberate fracturing of family units. Traditions, languages, and rituals that might have been transmitted from parent to child or shared within tight-knit communities were interrupted, fragmented, or lost entirely as enslaved people were shuffled between plantations and regions. Spiritual practices were suppressed, native languages were replaced by imposed speech, and celebrations of identity were often curtailed or clandestinely maintained, reflecting a constant tension between survival under oppression and the desire to maintain cultural continuity. This deliberate undermining of cultural transmission served both practical and psychological purposes for slaveholders. By weakening connections to ancestral identity, they diminished the likelihood of coordinated resistance, reinforced dependence upon the plantation system, and cultivated a sense of dislocation and vulnerability that facilitated ongoing control. Even in these oppressive circumstances, enslaved individuals displayed remarkable ingenuity in preserving aspects of their identity and heritage, passing down stories, skills, and beliefs through subtle and resilient forms of communication. Oral histories, songs, rituals, and clandestine gatherings became lifelines for cultural continuity, providing a framework for community cohesion despite the pervasive forces intent on erasing both personal and collective identity. Yet the trauma of family separation, coercive breeding practices, and the constant objectification of human life left deep psychological marks, fostering patterns of grief, loss, and intergenerational trauma that would echo long after emancipation. These patterns manifested in diminished stability, ongoing struggles with identity, and the necessity of rebuilding social bonds in the aftermath of slavery, highlighting how the economic imperatives of exploitation carried consequences far beyond the immediate generation. Historical testimonies, such as those collected by the Works Progress Administration and other chroniclers of enslaved life, provide vivid illustrations of this erosion. Former slaves recalled the anguish of having their children sold away, of being forced to witness intimate family moments transformed into instruments of profit, and of navigating a world in which their own agency was systematically denied. The grief, resilience, and resourcefulness documented in these narratives reveal the duality of experience, the brutal imposition of dehumanization alongside the persistent effort to maintain a sense of self. Familial connection and cultural grounding. This duality underscores the psychological complexity of slavery's legacy, in which survival required both adaptation to oppressive structures and the preservation of identity through acts of quiet defiance and cultural persistence. The lasting impact of slave breeding on identity and heritage cannot be overstated, as the trauma endured by one generation inevitably shaped the next, Children born into this system internalized lessons of vulnerability and subjugation, which affected parenting practices. Community cohesion and social expectations in the post-emancipation era. Efforts to reconstruct families, reclaim heritage, and assert individuality were often complicated by the lingering consequences of centuries of systematic dehumanization. Yet the persistence of African American cultural expression through music, storytelling, spiritual practice, and communal solidarity attests to the enduring strength and resistance of those who survived and sought to transmit their legacy. By examining the erosion of family bonds, personal identities, and cultural heritage through the lens of slave breeding, the true human cost of this practice comes into sharp focus. It illustrates that slavery was not merely an economic system of forced labor, but a deeply invasive social institution that sought to control, fragment, and exploit human beings at every level. The intergenerational trauma left in its wake is a testament to both the cruelty of the system and the resilience of those who endured it. And understanding this legacy is essential for appreciating the profound historical and moral implications that continue to shape societies today. Through this lens, the narrative of slavery is revealed not only as a story of oppression, but also as a chronicle of survival, adaptation, and the unbroken will to maintain identity and heritage against the most systematic forces of erasure. Even in the darkest chapters of human history, the story of enslaved Africans in the Americas is not only one of suffering and exploitation, but also a testament to resilience, courage, and the enduring strength of human agency. Despite the oppressive systems that sought to control every aspect of their lives, from the commodification of their bodies to the fragmentation of families, the erasure of cultural heritage, and the relentless calculation of their labor value, enslaved people continuously found ways to assert their autonomy, preserve their humanity, and resist the forces that sought to define them solely as property. Their resistance took many forms, some visible and bold, others subtle and enduring, but all reflected an unwavering determination to assert identity, claim dignity, and preserve the bonds that slavery sought to destroy. Escapes were among the most direct and daring forms of resistance. Across plantations and throughout the Americas, enslaved men, women, and even children risked everything to flee the brutal conditions imposed upon them. The network of escape routes, famously exemplified by the Underground Railroad in the United States, provided not only a physical pathway to freedom, but also a symbolic assertion that slavery's grip could be challenged. Every successful escape represented a refusal to accept a life defined by subjugation, an act of courage that inspired others, and a stark reminder to slaveholders that their control was neither absolute nor unassailable. Each journey to freedom carried immense risk, punishment, recapture, or even death, but the desire for autonomy and self-determination drove countless individuals to take these perilous steps, demonstrating that the human spirit cannot be fully contained, even under the harshest conditions. Legal challenges also became powerful tools for asserting agency and challenging the system. Landmark cases, such as Somerset in 1772 and Knight versus Wedderburn in 1778, illuminated the tensions between the legal frameworks that upheld slavery and the moral and ethical arguments against it, establishing precedents that would inform abolitionist movements for generations. In the Americas, enslaved and formerly enslaved people used the courts to fight for freedom, property rights, or family reunification whenever possible, navigating a system designed to deny them justice with remarkable ingenuity and persistence. Each legal victory, no matter how limited, represented a crack in the edifice of oppression, a moment in which the principles of justice and humanity temporarily asserted themselves in defiance of entrenched economic and social power. Cultural preservation was perhaps the most enduring form of resistance. allowing enslaved people to maintain a sense of identity and continuity even when their physical and social worlds were violently disrupted. Through oral storytelling, music, spiritual practices, and communal rituals, African traditions were adapted and transmitted across generations, creating resilient cultural frameworks that resisted erasure. Songs of work and sorrow, coded messages embedded in spirituals, and the preservation of ancestral knowledge all functioned as acts of defiance, asserting that enslaved people were not mere property but bearers of culture, memory, and moral agency. Even under constant surveillance and the threat of punishment, enslaved communities cultivated shared spaces, sometimes hidden, sometimes fleeting, where they could exercise control over their own narratives, reinforce bonds of kinship, and nurture hope for a life beyond the constraints imposed upon them. This resilience and agency were not only acts of personal survival but also laid the foundations for broader movements toward freedom and justice. The courage displayed by those who resisted in whatever ways they could inspired abolitionists, both black and white, to amplify their calls for the end of slavery, ultimately influencing legislation, social reforms, and the eventual emancipation of millions. The collective memory of resistance became a source of identity and pride, forming the roots of communities that would continue to fight for civil rights, equality, and recognition long after slavery itself had been legally abolished. It is a testament to the enduring power of human dignity that even in a system designed to crush it, enslaved people managed to assert their will, preserve their heritage, and nurture hope for the future. As we reflect on this history, it is crucial to honor both the suffering and the resistance, recognizing that the full story of slavery is not only one of oppression but also one of courage, creativity, and unbreakable human spirit. By remembering the strategies, sacrifices, and resilience of enslaved Africans, we gain insight into the enduring strength of communities under duress, the importance of cultural preservation, and the power of agency even in the most restrictive circumstances. Their stories remind us that oppression, no matter how systematic or brutal, cannot entirely erase the drive for freedom, identity, and self-determination, and that the legacy of resilience continues to inform contemporary struggles for justice and equality. Thank you so much for watching this video and joining us in exploring this deeply important history. If you found this story meaningful, insightful, or moving, please take a moment to like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel to continue uncovering stories that reveal the truths of our shared past. Your support helps us bring more narratives to light, encourage reflection, and ensure that the lessons of history are remembered and honored. Remember to click the notification bell so you never miss our new content, and join our growing community dedicated to learning, empathy, and awareness. From all of us here, we hope this journey through history has been enlightening and thought-provoking, and we wish you a peaceful and restful night. Sleep well, and may the lessons of courage, resilience, and humanity stay with you as you rest.